So you want to learn some GeoGuessr meta? Well, you came to the right place here today. Today we'll be going over camera generations, which is something that I talk about on my channel quite frequently, and maybe some of you don't know what that is. But after this video, I guarantee you will. So let's go. So why I care about camera generations at all? Why does it matter? Well, some countries have certain generations and others do not. So it's very useful for determining which countries it is and which it cannot. So it's very good for process of elimination. We will get into some of those examples at the very end, so stick around for that. There are currently 4 camera generations in the game of GeoGuessr as of recording this today, plus a couple of, I don't know, extra ones that we'll talk about at the end. But we're going to start off with the very first generation here, which is generation 1. It goes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And generation 1 is the very first one ever released. I'm not exactly sure what date it was, but I think it was 2006 or 7. This one was in 2007 here. And as you can see, generation 1 is just really, really bad. You cannot see anything. You can't even read this street sign here, which is literally almost right in front of you. You should be able to read that, but unfortunately, you can't. Luckily, you won't have to see generation 1 too often when you're playing the game of GeoGuessr, because it's not really included in any official or even big community maps. The only time you'll run into it is moving rounds. Yes, if you're gonna move around in GeoGuessr, you might accidentally stumble across a road like this one that only has generation 1. Moss Road here in New Zealand does not have any updated coverage. The last time a Google car drove on this road is 2008, and that's why you see generation 1. For the most part, all this coverage has been overwritten, but there is still a decent amount in, like, Australia, for example, has a lot of generation 1 still. Luckily, generation 1 is really only found in a few different countries. The United States, Australia, and New Zealand are by far the 3 most common that you'll see generation 1, but you may also see it in Japan, Italy, France, Canada, and Mexico. I think that's it, but those are all very rare, and honestly, you don't have to worry too much about generation 1. Next up, generation 2. Generation 2, as you can see, a little bit easier to read. This clearly says Mason here now. The best way to tell generation 2 apart from any other generation is actually very easy. Just look down at this blur and you will see a pretty large, massive circular blur. It's a bit hard to see in this particular location, but you can kind of see it over here at least, that there's basically a perfect circle. And if you look up, you will also see it in the sky. This one is a bit faint. Let's take a look at a more obvious one. So here we have a little bit of a more obvious one. As you can see, there is clearly a circle that goes around this car, and it is a perfect circle. You won't see a perfect circle in any other generation except for an exception we'll get to at the end. But this perfect circle here is an easy sign that you're in generation 2. And also, if you look up, this is what is called the halo. In the community, they call this the halo. And basically, it's another pretty much perfect circle here that often has a bit of a discoloration. This one's a bit of a purple tint that tends to happen a lot in generation 2, where you get these colored tints on the top and bottom. And yeah, this is the second generation of the Google car, a Google camera, and it's once again fairly easy to recognize. Now we get to the most common generation in GeoGuessr right now, which is generation 3. It's not the most important to learn because, well, it is the most common. It's more important to learn generation 2 and probably 4. But it is still critical to understand exactly what this looks like, especially when you're comparing it to 3 and 4, which sometimes can get confusing. So basically, you want to look at the type of blur here, and the blur will be kind of subtle, but you can pick out here that there is a bit of a blur that's extending from all 4 sides, kind of like where the wheels are supposed to be here. So you have these 4 blurs that are popping out here by the wheels. This is very common in generation 3. In fact, I'm pretty sure it happens on every generation 3 car. Here's another example of a generation 3 here. We are in the Dominican Republic, which is only generation 3. They don't have anything else there. So this is the car that they have. And as you can see, they still have that blur, even though you can visibly see the roof rack here, which is a huge sign that you're in Dominican Republic. And you can also see the white part of the car as well. You still have that generation 3 blur. So yeah, always keep in mind the blur. Look down, you know, when you're playing GeoGuessr, and it will be very helpful. Wow, look how crisp this looks. We are now in generation 4, the latest iteration of the Google camera. Will it be the last? I hope not. Can it even get better than this? I think it could. Maybe we'll see a 5th generation sometime in the future. But right now, this is the latest that we'll get here. And let's take a look at the Google car itself. Notice how there's not really a jutting out of the blur here in generation 4. There is a little bit. It's not perfectly even on all sides. You can see it comes out a little bit like that. But this type of color in the back here, if I want to move my little arrow, there you go, you can kind of see it now. it's oftentimes blue. Here's an example of a very common Generation 4 car. The blue tint is pretty common when it comes to Generation 4. If you see this, it's almost always going to be Gen 4. And there's also somewhat of a discoloration here in New Zealand. But what they try to do is they try to mimic what they see on the ground, right? So if they see some white specks on the ground like they do here, they're going to kind of mimic it in the blur. But Generation 4 is pretty easy to identify. If you see this blue blur, you're not going to see that ever in Generation 3, or obviously not in Generation 2 or 1. And just looking around here, the saturation of Generation 4 is also much better. So let's take a look at the saturation here. So this is Generation 4. As I said, we're going to hop back down to 2016, and we're going to see the difference here. As you can see, it's a bit not as colorful. It's a bit drier. I mean, especially look at these oranges. It's very dull. It still looks good. Generation 3 still looks good, but it's just not like Generation 4 where the colors just pop a little bit more. I mean, they just do. Look at the orange over there. If you go back this way, the orange is just a little bit lighter, you know, and it's even a winter day here. Now, as Google adds coverage to existing roads, basically they drive over the same roads they already have and get better updated coverage. Like recently that happened in Senegal, where they had all Generation 3 basically, and now they have a lot of 4s. And we just dropped into one of the 4s here. They use this pickup truck here, and it has that same Generation 4 blur, but it's weird because it's a pickup truck. Yeah, this used to all be Generation 3, so it is important to kind of keep up with what Google is doing themselves. Let's get to the bonus camera generation here on screen. Take a look at that. That is a person carrying the Google camera. This is what's known as the Trekker camera, and this is basically, some people have differing opinions on what Trekker means. I personally think it's basically anything that's not a Google car in street view. So whether it be on a boat, whether it be a person walking, whether it be on like a bike of some sort, or like a four-wheeler, there are a lot of different vehicles, like a camel. There's a camel out there with the Trekker on it. I wouldn't consider that to be a street view car. All right, I just wouldn't. And so here we are, obviously not on a road. We are clearly in the middle of a forest. There's a person with a gun here. Very interesting Trekker location. It's important to learn your Trekker locations because some countries only have Trekker, just like Costa Rica here. If I gave you this location, you may be like, what is this? It looks like I'm on Street View. But then you take a look down and you realize, well, this isn't really, this blur is way too small to be a car. This doesn't make any sense at all. And now I'm walking on the sidewalk. Look at this blur. This is not one of the 4 that we talked about earlier. This is actually Trekker. Okay, so it's actually kind of a sneaky one because, you know, if I'm an NMPZ and I'm looking this way, you know, it might seem like I'm actually on a street and this is Street View. So it is kind of important to learn a little bit about Trekker, and we are in Costa Rica, which only has Trekker. So if you were in Street View, you know, you couldn't be in this country. A couple of exceptions. 1, India. India has what is called the India Cam. That's what's been coined, I guess, in the community. It's basically just a larger Generation 2 blur that is a lot more obvious on screen. So here it is. It's huge circular blur. It's almost an instant sign that you're going to be in India. You can also find this blur in Nigeria, which is pretty massive. It doesn't really line up with any of the generations that we talked about previously. Technically, this is Generation 4. It came out in 2022, but the blur is a lot bigger, as you can see here. And this is like a Nigerian type of thing, pretty much exclusive to here. You might find it in like Senegal as well. So yeah, here we are in Senegal. It's a very similar blur. I think it has to do with the camera placement and not necessarily the type of camera used. But here we are in Senegal as well. The next sort of exception to the rule is Switzerland, which has low cam, and also Japan. We'll talk about Switzerland first. Switzerland basically has a wider Generation 3 blur. So as you can see, it has those little indents by the wheels, but it's just wider out than a normal Generation 3 car would be. So this is an easy way to tell that you're in low cam. Also, just looking around, it kind of seems lower, but don't really rely on that because sometimes, even in countries that it's not low cam, it might seem a little bit lower for whatever reason. Check the blur. The blur is going to be a lot more consistent and a lot more reliable when you're determining if it's low cam or not. It could be a little bit harder to do that though in Japan because it does have a lot of Generation 4. But as you can see, the blur does exceed out a little bit on both sides, even in Japan, even though it's actually quite hard to see. So obviously look at other clues as well. You know, take a look at the scenery, take a look at the surroundings, take a look at the language and stuff before making your guess. But it is still possible. And of course, if I go on a older road, you know, it's pretty obvious here. It does go out quite a far in Generation 3. versus Generation 4 that we just saw. So yeah, that is something to keep in mind. More and more countries are adding low cam though as privacy concerns come about. For example, Sri Lanka recently wanted low cam in their country instead of the normal cam they used to have. So now in Generation 4 only, in Sri Lanka, it is low camera. Here are some very useful tips that you should probably know. And I went through this a little bit in some previous Learn GeoGuessr videos, but it's very important to learn. First of all, if you're in Africa, the only country that has Generation 2 is South Africa. That's right. South Africa is the only country with a Generation 2. So if you see that and you know that you're in Africa, you're going to be in this country. Staking in this region, South Africa is the only country out of these 4 that has Generation 4. Fitting, isn't it? So, South Africa, the only country here with Generation 2 and 4. Lesotho, Eswatini, and Botswana all have Generation 3. Keep in mind, though, South Africa also has Generation 3. There are a lot of countries in Europe that do not have Generation 2. All of the Baltic states here, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Slovakia all do not have Generation 2. A lot of countries down here also don't have Generation 2. Slovenia, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia, and even Bulgaria all also don't have Generation 2. Greece does. And most countries over here in Western Europe also has Generation 2. In fact, a lot of these countries only have Generation 3. Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and also Ukraine don't have Gen 4 either. They only have Generation 3. South America has been getting some Generation 4 coverage, which is very nice, but a few countries still don't have it. One of them is being Uruguay here, another is Bolivia, and the other is Ecuador. Every other country has at least a little bit of Generation 4 coverage in the country, but these 3 do not. So it's actually super helpful. If you do get Gen 4, you can rule out those 3 countries immediately. Obviously, there are a lot of countries. I can't go over all of them in this one video. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more on what countries have what generations, check out the website in the description called geohints.com. Take a look at that, and it has basically all the information that you can possibly need. Now, of course, this is not a complete list of everything Camera Generation. This was basically everything you need to know. All the generations, all the exceptions. There might be a few more exceptions. There's always an exception to the rule. There are so many more Camera Generation metas that you can use and employ. And I also have a couple more that I've said in my Learn GeoGuessr series. So if you haven't seen all those videos, I highly recommend it. I did hope you learned something in this video, though, of course. And if you did, be sure to leave a like. I would really appreciate that. And as always, I will see you in the next video. See you, everybody.